The flashback from over 100 years ago continues, and now we finally know why Loki always keeps his eyes covered. The cover page of One Piece chapter 1153, titled The Birth of Loki, features Yamato happily reuniting with Kikunojo, who is now the daimyo of Ringo. The Moonflower Ocho was there too. And at this point, I just need to come to terms with the fact that Yamato's cover story is never going to end. But the actual story picks up way back in the past. When they were kids, Dory and Brogy were tiny compared to their childhood friend, Prince Harold. And the three soon-to-be legends all happily embraced their bruises together. Prince Harold's weapon of choice was a huge hammer, so Loki followed in his father's footsteps with that too. And the young prince was a little too young for his facial tattoo just yet. Thanks to his ancient giant blood, Prince Harold's body was especially big. His strength was unrivaled, and he had very high status in his homeland. As a result of all that, he grew to be a very arrogant and troublesome youth who no one could properly handle. As a teenager, King Harold lounged and picked his nose. To the king, everyone who wasn't from Elbaf was simply too weak and puny to matter. Just a flick of his booger was as strong as cannon fire, and the king's guards dutifully agreed with anything he said. At some point, King Harold and his men traveled to the kingdom of Bunt in the New World. There was a circus in town that supposedly featured a captive giant from Elbaf. A horned and caged female giant glared and roared at the many humans below. King Harold saw the display from his binoculars and was furious. During such a time period, when the infamy of giants was at its greatest, this was a very bold move. It didn't take long at all for the giants of Elbaf to stomp the circus out and liberate the captive giant. She had no idea who they were. Those horns of hers were just for show. She wasn't actually from Elbaf. The valiant giants assured the damsel that there was no need to thank them. Harold introduced himself as the king of Elbaf and mentioned his obligation to the honor of his people. In response, the giant woman angrily slapped the king across the face. The onlooking crew members couldn't believe it. They shouted loud enough to rock the ship. Something like this had never happened before, so they were in an uproar. Despite being the king's guards, the guy was so tough that actually protecting him wasn't something they were used to. King Harold had never been reprimanded like this in his life, so he was distraught. Shaking as she assessed the damages, the circus giant insisted that the king apologize for hurting so many people. King Harold couldn't believe she actually wanted to go back to the kingdom of little dolls. The woman raised a quivering fist. She gave the king a major beatdown for that, which was yet another first for him. It turns out that the humans took her in after finding her on the brink of death. And it was thanks to their kindness that she was able to earn enough to eat and heal back up. That little doll's comment was just way too much for her, so she grabbed the king and gave him a reality check. She told the man that he just so happened to be born big, that his overwhelming strength was merely a quirk of fate. She cut even deeper by calling him an arrogant disgrace for believing he was superior to humans. From her perspective, the savages of Elbaf gave giants the world over a bad name. No one had ever spoken to the young king like this, so it really hit him hard. In giant terms, he was still a 15-year-old kid, so that was just the kind of corrective action that he needed. He swallowed his pride and let her return to the humans. Once there, she worked up a sweat helping the humans rebuild. They were grateful and kind to her despite the difference in stature. The king's guards wondered if they would be leaving, but King Harold had something else in mind. He shouted at his men to go help the humans rebuild their tiny model city. In no time, the place was back up and running. And in the process, they learned that human construction techniques were totally different from theirs. The little people even offered to teach the giants their ways. How they used spices and flavored their food was different too. Even their fabrics were impressive. Belonging to a culture that wasn't based on brawn and plunder like the giants led the humans to hone their minds and become skilled with their hands. The giant woman even extended a hand to the uncertain king. She brought him before the human king of Bunt with his head low in apology. Once that was settled, several human children clambered onto the giant king, daring to get closer to him than his own subjects would. At night, the giants and humans happily did the Nika shuffle together. The disastrous king learned that the destruction of anything in the world was a waste. Eventually, the foreign giant departed with the king and joined him on his travels. Together, they encountered all sorts of humans, but instead of antagonizing them, King Harold raised the white flag and flashed them a grin. The giant lady explained that she was born on Samuanai, an island in the South Blue. One thing led to another, and she wound up on the sea. King Harold questioned if she'd gone over the blood-soaked serpent. She realized that he was talking about the red line and agreed. She wouldn't be able to return home. That blood-soaked serpent comment is also something we heard from Dorian Broggie and is something we discussed at length thanks to the Elbaf children's mural. King Harold soon became a generous man who helped people just because he could. He invited the foreign giant to come to Elbaf. He let her know that they're not as savage as she thinks. She agreed and admitted that she may have judged them too harshly. And there's no doubt that the king of Elbaf was in love, the effects of which were very noticeable. And considering who he was not too long ago, it makes sense that some found it to be unsettling. After about a year, King Harold finally returned home. He came back a changed man and sought to do the same thing for his people. He decided that it was time for them to atone for their countless sins, much to the confusion and concern of his citizens. As their king, he decided that from now on, he would spend much of his time traveling overseas. He hoped to reconcile with their neighbors and learn from cultures beyond their own. The king concluded that their land could only benefit from learning from the rest of the world. That's when a heckler shouted that the rambunctious Dorian Broggie would never stop running amok. But those two were the king's oldest friends, and he always knew that they were different. Long before the king came to these realizations, the ogre duo always treated humans fairly with honor and respect. Some wondered if they would still be able to uphold their warrior ways. The king admitted that they may need to reconsider some of their traditions if they cause other countries to feel threatened. And despite this all happening over 100 years ago, we actually have a Panda Man sighting. The last time we saw this guy was about a year ago with chapter 1117. The Greybeards, Ja Rule and Jo Rule, were intrigued by the changes. And clearly these guys were just born old or something. But it was clear to the king's lover that both Harold and Elbaf were blessed. King Harold set sail many times after that. He exchanged a huge bottle of giant booze for many human kegs. And with a skull on one of them, clearly this was their strongest stuff. The king strove for strong diplomatic relationships and deep cultural understanding. At first, he had to rationalize those things as fancy hostage negotiations. But thankfully, Ida was there to help guide him. Ultimately, the goal was always international cooperation. And they were at this for years. Almost a quarter of a century later, King Harold and Ida finally had a baby together. The king was overjoyed and excited to be a father, but that was swiftly disturbed by the traditionalist elders of Elbaf. They refused to acknowledge the marriage since only pure blood would be accepted as a member of the royal family. Certain traditions were unshakable, so reluctantly, the king's vision of a happy family would never be the case. Thankfully, Ida was very understanding. Such things came down to culture, and their feelings would not be enough to change that. However, the giants of the eastern fishing village had really taken a liking to her and the baby. So they offered her a permanent home on Elbaf. She happily agreed. That way, Haradin could at least stay close to his father. From there, King Harold was introduced to his culturally acceptable bride. Estrid was from Alcohol Village of northern Elbaf. Notably, she also possessed the noble blood of ancient giant ancestry. Estrid considered herself to be a student of the earth-wind arts, what seems to be like the study of feng shui for the giants of Elbaf. The first thing Estrid ever said to King Harold was the declaration that she's fated to love him for the rest of her life. The second thing she said was that he can just forget about the Western woman he fell in love with and stood by for over 2 decades, along with her bastard son. King Harold was far more civil than he once was, and responded with discomfort and apprehension instead of aggression. Now, the fun thing about superstitious characters is that the truth may be expressed in seemingly silly ways. Considering the significance of culture and tradition, especially with this flashback, there's no reason for us to discount her words. Estrid was right about being fated to love King Harold for the rest of her life, or at least as much as a person like her could love someone. Notice how she never said anything about Harold returning her affection. And thanks to the people of Elbaf, we know that the queen died roughly a year after Loki was born. So the rest of her life was pretty accurate. We can also see that King Harold's beard started growing around this time. According to Estrid, the energies of the royal chambers were aligned to the east, something that was apparently unacceptable. She claimed that King Harold's spirit was leaking out, that they needed to shut the windows immediately. Before the king could get a word in, she continued. She told the guards to get rid of a certain mirror that was positioned in a lethal 5-star configuration. In regards to an eastern alignment, we know that to the east of Elbaf would be Wano. With King Harold's insistence on foreign relations, an alliance with the samurai would have changed the world forever. So Estrid may have shifted the trajectory of that fate. When it comes to the king's spirit, that sounds like Conqueror's Haki to me. A power that's notorious for leaking out unconsciously, something we were reminded of in the previous chapter thanks to Zoro. Lastly, a lethal 5-star configuration just screams the world government and the 5 elders. But how and why would a mirror be the source of such concerns? Well, since this took place 81 years ago, it only makes sense that most devil fruits would have different users. This all took place way before Linlin's rampage, so Charlotte Brûlé obviously wasn't the user of the Mirror no Mi. As a reminder, that devil fruit gave her access to her own isolated mirror dimension, along with what was effectively portal travel. The world government has never been fond of others possessing that level of accessibility to the wider world, so I can only imagine that they would have been using it to their own ends for a good while. Big Mom was one of the foremost devil fruit collectors in the world. She also wasn't the sort of pirate who'd back down from a fight against the world government, so I'm sure you can imagine how getting the power back would have been an issue. From there, Estrid introduced the king to Ashura, the horse of good fortune. The beast was a gift from her family that was sure to bring him good luck. It even had 8 legs with a mane that looked like a series of flaming pillars. So even by Elbaf standards, this beast was a freak of nature. If 8 legs was strange, and he was a horse of good fortune, then I'm inclined to believe that Ashura was a genetic defect that managed to not only survive, but thrive. But unfortunately, we know that Ashura died shortly after Loki was born. The name Ashura itself stems from Hinduism and Buddhism. The Ashura, as I'm sure we've discussed on this channel before, were said to be a type of incredibly powerful being. They were effectively titans with demonic traits who opposed the Deva, and the Deva were gods. However, the Deva weren't all-powerful or supreme beings. Generally, the Ashura were framed as antagonists who envied the divine beings. But for the giants of Elbaf, demonic-looking titans were simply a description of their ancestry. Ancestors who, unbeknownst to them, waged war against the so-called gods of the world government. But Estrid was coming off as a bit too generous here, and that was not the goal. So her next command was for the guards to take all of the castle's jewels and gold to her room. She insisted that the king's surroundings should be focused on the energies of earth and wind, of which she was clearly already acquainted. Lastly, from now on, the king and queen would only accept their meals on silver platters. So yeah, not the most likable lady around. About 70 years ago, the rough seas made travel between islands a real challenge. It was actually Elbaf's advanced navigation techniques that changed how the world traveled, which reflects nicely on Road as the navigator for the new giant warrior pirates. King Harold often returned with stories of far-off lands like Fishman Island. He spoke of Prince Neptune's birth, of fishmen, mermen, and the various other sea creatures who celebrated alongside them. 63 years ago, the king was away at sea. Alone, Queen Estrid was congratulated on the birth of their son. She named him Loki, which she apparently spoke to the king about. The queen was very eager to get a look at her baby's face, but what she saw disturbed her deeply. Prince Loki's eyes were not normal. The queen scrambled back in fear and revulsion. She refused to accept that such a thing could ever be hers. She demanded that the servants tell the king that the baby didn't make it. She called her own child an unacceptable curse and monster because of his appearance. an appearance that was simply the combined traits of his ancient blooded parents. So besides having the horns of their ancestors, it seems like Loki also gained unique eyes. And I have to wonder if this is purely cosmetic or there might be something deeper behind this. Tragically, when the Prince of Elbaf reached out for aid, no one held him. The queen grabbed baby Loki and rushed off in a frenzy. She callously tossed the innocent infant into the realm of the dead. And from then on, she made the mention of his existence forbidden. Sometime later, the queen began packing her things, all of which were shiny and valuable. She planned on returning to her village and never giving birth again. But one of the guards had dire news. There was something coming from the realm of the dead. The queen was hideously enraged and didn't like the direction of his message. Prince Loki refused to die. He was covered in blood, snow, and tears. He scaled the side of the Atom Tree after slaughtering a titanic beast. And it was soon after hearing about the approach of her fiendish baby that Queen Estrid collapsed from poor health. From her bed, she ordered the guards to get rid of Loki. She claimed that King Harold would one day be slain by his own son. The queen had clearly gone mad and was weaponizing her faith. Meanwhile, the king knew nothing about this and was simply frustrated by the limitations of diplomacy. After dedicating decades to foreign relations, the king's efforts had been opposed by the world government on many occasions. He began to question why countries couldn't just be free, which was a very dangerous sentiment for him to hold. Ida, meanwhile, was a very affectionate and caring mother to Harudin. She reminded her son that Loki is his little brother. She wondered if he didn't want to see him, but Loki's older brother refused to recognize him as his sibling since they didn't share the same mother. But unlike with his father, who she just beat up, Ida couldn't bring herself to scold such an adorable face, even when he said such awful things. From then on, every bad thing that ever happened to Elbaf was said to be a result of Loki's curse. So Loki is officially in the running for one of the most tragic backstories in One Piece. And he might have also been the strongest baby in One Piece. Elbaf does not deserve this guy at all. Loki's entire life has been miserable and unnecessarily cruel. Yet he still manages to usually have a smile on his face. And it looks like Luffy will be the one to liberate him from his seemingly cursed fate. I wouldn't be surprised if he thinks that Loki's eyes are really cool. But this is just the beginning of the accursed prince's life, so I'm definitely looking forward to more and hope you are too. As always, I'm Sliceable Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.